Today is Wednesday, Yudalad Ir, Pesach Sheni, and we're in Teres Menachem, Sefer HaMamorim, Tavshin Yud Aleph, Tavshin Yud Beis, in the Maimer of Yud Beis Tammuz, Tavshin Yud Aleph, and we are at the top of page Kuf Yud Beis, the latter part of Ois Beis, chapter 2, page Kuf Yud Beis at the top. We're discussing the difference between, we're learning about the difference between Avodas HaBirurim and Avodas HaNisyonos. Serving Hashem in a way of refining Gashmias, lifting Gashmias, and serving Hashem through tests. And the Rebbe explained that these two modes of serving Hashem are different in the three components that make up each of these three. They're different in the three components that make up each of these two modes of serving Hashem. In each one of these you have the thing with which one does the Avodah, with what one serves Hashem, the situation, the object, the circumstances. Then you have the person who does the Avodah, who serves Hashem. And then you have the method of the Avodah, the method of how one actually carries out the task. And they're different in each of these three. And the Rebbe starts explaining this. He says that when we talk about Avodas HaBirurim, serving Hashem through refining Gashmias, the method is in such a way that we actually refine the godly spark, the godly energy that is present within the thing or the circumstances, the object with which we are working. Not so when we serve Hashem through Avodas HaNisyonos, serving Hashem through tests. So the Rebbe says that that which represents the test, but the thing in which the test has clothed itself, doesn't really exist. Eine b'metzias, it's not in existence. But the Rebbe qualifies that by saying it means that it must have a godly energy, because otherwise it would not exist at all. It wouldn't be presented to the person at all. As said before, the whole purpose of the test is designed as a hindrance in order for the person to overcome that. So that type of existence must also have a godly energy. Why? Because otherwise it wouldn't exist at all. Not even in that way. Not even in that tiny little bit of existence of existing solely and only for the purpose of the person overcoming that particular obstacle. Why? Because no existence is possible without divine energy. So what's the difference between the spark, the nitzutz eliki, the godly spark that is present within something which represents a test, as opposed to the nitzutz eliki, the godly spark that is present within something that exists for the purpose of refining it? So he says the difference is in the degree to which it has become swallowed up and consumed by the object. And we left off, he said when it talks about the soyin, in the situation of the soyin, the godly spark has become so swallowed up within the thing that represents the test that it has become dark itself. And he brought an example from a halachic concept called ukemei chaticha atzma naasis nevela. That's where we stopped, and I didn't explain that yesterday, and I'll explain that now. We're all familiar with the concept of not mixing milk and meat. Basar b'chalav is prohibited. What happens if a drop of milk falls onto a piece of meat? So the question is the piece of meat 60 times the size of the drop of milk or not? If it is, obviously we're talking in a situation where the meat would absorb the milk, right? When it's cooking and so on and so forth. So, in a situation where, if the piece of meat is more than 60 times the amount of milk that fell on it, it's bottle, right? Bottle b'shishim. If the milk is less than 60 times, if the meat is less than 60 times the amount of milk that fell on it, it's osur. Why? Because then it's already nois in tam. Nois in tam. It gives taste. Less than 60 times the amount of the milk, if the meat is less than 60 times, the milk has a discernible impact and presence in the meat.
Any idea why they chose the 60th?
That's the ratio. That's the ratio.
No, but why is it the ratio? It's a very big question.
That's
Exactly what I've been
the
wondering.
Shiur, and then it becomes discernible.
That's what the Torah says.
That's what you're not thinking. It's you jumping out of a decimal system into a system based on 60s, which is a Babylonian system, which is the whole time thing of
Okay.
of wiping the 12 months, 12 and 60 seconds in a minute and 6 minutes an hour. It's a whole based on 60. So it's actually a thing. Why 60?
All right, but over here, the reason the Mishnah, the reason the Gemara says, the Mishnah and the Gemara say, is because less than 60 it's been a sinas tam, more than 60 it's not been a sinas tam. They're talking about a phenomenon, a physical phenomenon. Whether the isur is felt or present enough within the meat. Okay, but let's accept that for whatever reason. It's less than 60, it's asur, more than 60 it's mutter. So this is the concept of bottle b'shishim. Something becomes non-existent or non-present, it becomes annulled if it is 60, if it falls within 60 or more. Now let's take this piece of meat that has now become asur. You have a piece of meat that became asur, became prohibited because it was mixed with milk, and the milk and the meat is less than 60 times the amount of the milk. So now the piece of meat became asur, right? It's prohibited. Now this piece of meat falls into a pot of kosher meat, right? So what happens now? You again have the concept of bottle b'shishim, right? If the meat is, if the meat, the kosher meat, is more than 60 times the amount of the isur that fell in, then it's mutter, right? If it's less than 60 times, then it's asur. More than 60 times of what? Of the original milk that fell into the original piece, that was mixed into the original piece of meat, or more than 60 times the whole piece of meat? The whole piece of meat. That's the concept of the chticha atzma nasis nevela. That the whole piece of meat has now become nevela. Now, how do you teach nevela in English? Nevela, an abomination, or not an abomination is not the teach of nevela. Kids are prohibited. Non-kosher, right? So the whole piece of meat now becomes isur. So it's not only that we reckon the original amount of the substance that made it prohibited, but the prohibited substance, in the case where it becomes asur, it causes the whole piece to become like a piece of isur. The whole piece becomes a piece of nevela. And therefore, as a consequence, when this piece falls into heter, you have to have more than 60 than the whole piece of meat. What happened over here? The isur, the prohibited substance, has had such an impact, such an influence on the heter, on the permitted substance, that it has completely overwhelmed the heter, the permitted substance, and made it all isur. Similarly, says the Rebbe, that is how a nitzutz eliki. This is a parable that Rebbe uses as a moshel, as a dugma, as an example rather. He uses it as an example for the idea of the godly energy that finds itself within the matter or the circumstances that create the nisayon, the test. Although it must have a godly energy, because nothing can exist without a godly energy, but the nisayon part of what makes up in the anatomy of the nisayon, you have the nisayon, and you have the godly energy that sustains it. So the nisayon, the circumstances, the matter, the circumstances, the object, the situation that presents the nisayon is like the isur. The godly energy is like what? like the heter, and the matter, the circumstances of the nisayon are so powerful that it overwhelms the nitzutz eliki, and it's like the nitzutz eliki, the godly spark, has become completely dark. Just like over here, just like in the chticha asmas nasnas nevela, that the isur, the prohibited substance, overwhelms the heter substance to the extent that the whole thing becomes asur. The whole thing becomes prohibited. You with me? That's the dogma that Rebbe brings. That's the example that Rebbe brings for the existence of the godly spark within a matter or situation that presents an Nisayon test. So we are on page Kuf Yud Beis, 6 lines from the top, by the full stop. The line starts Chaticha. V'zeu achiluk bein hadavar hamisbarer ladavar shebein asa nisayon. This is the difference between that which is refined to that which presents a test. Shebedover hamisbarer yesh nitzutz sheichen l'kleris b'shem nitzutz. When we talk about something which is going to be refined, it has a spark of energy, godly energy, divine energy, which could be called, you could discern it as a spark of light. Why? Since it exists there in a mode of light. Not so when we talk about a test. What remains from the from the godly spark that finds itself in this that is present within this nisayon, within the test? All that's left is its existence, merely its existence. Why? Because all other aspects of this divine energy, this godly energy that sustains the test, besides it's just the fact that it exists, which we know by virtue of the fact that the test exists, everything else has become so influenced by what the test represents, that it has become completely dark and subsumed. If you will, latent. Okay? So this is the difference between how the godly energy is present within a test and how the godly energy is present within something which is to be refined. This brings us to the difference between how one deals with a test as opposed to how one deals with something that needs to be refined. As mentioned before, the Rebbe said, if you remember, that how do you deal with a test? You don't interact and work with the test and fight the test or try to engage the test. What do? You stand with an essential steadfastness which emanates from an essential bittul, self-annulment, against the test, and you consider it as if it doesn't exist. You don't deal with it at all. You don't enter into discussions or debates or interactions and so on and so forth. You just, as if it were, make believe like it doesn't exist. And you carry on. Why? When we talk about a davar hamizbarer, something which needs to be refined, you work with it. You work with it and you deal with it and so on and so forth. Why the difference in how you interact with these two? That stems from how the nitzutz eliki, the godly spark, is present within the nisayon. That's what the Rebbe says in the next part. Mitzad achiluk hanal.
In the Holocaust, in the yeshivot, where they felt to ignore the test, and they perished.
Correct. That's why I mentioned yesterday that surely there must be other things in life that fall into other categories outside of these. There are certain things that stand as much. Well, let's put it this way. You could deal with it. You could let's talk about a situation where one doesn't perish. God forbid, somebody's faced with a tragedy, terrible tragedy, right? You mentioned yesterday the test of poverty. So if somebody is poor, right, and ignores the poverty, does it mean that he'll become rich? Oder yeah, oder nicht. Just ignoring the fact that somebody is poor doesn't make you rich. You need to win the lottery. You need the Eibishter to send you a bracha from heaven. You need to have an opportunity that Eibishter presents to you, right?
You need to do some work.
You need to do some work. That's what I'm talking about. An opportunity that Eibishter presents to you. It's like the famous anecdote with a chap that was lived in a tower block and there was a tsunami, and they said the Eibishter will help. The fire department came on the ground. The Eibishter will help. the water was rising, he came up to the 20th floor, a boat came by, he says, the Eibishter will help. Finally, he was forced to go onto the roof, and a helicopter came. He says, the Eibishter will help. He drowned. So he came up to heaven, and he said to the Rebbeinu Shalom, you let me down. So Hashem says, what do you mean? I sent you 3 opportunities to save you. Right? So, you can't just sit there and ignore circumstances and hope for the best, so to speak, right? In certain situations, of course. So it's not, let's put it this way, one needs to define, and not now is the time to have the discussion, first of all, because I want to finish the Ma'amim, and second of all, because I have to confess that it's not even clear in my own mind exactly what falls into which bracket, okay? But clearly, there must be certain things that fall outside of these 2 modes of Avedis Abirurim and Avedis Anisyonis. As it's articulated over here. What?
How do you recognize which is which?
You could. Look, let's put it this way.
Eyesight you can.
Well, in a situation where one is faced with a difficulty, so there are 2 ways of dealing with that difficulty, of the difficulty being solved. Either the problem goes away, right?
But that doesn't solve the problem, it's gone.
The problem for the person. It's gone, so the problem is no longer there. Hang on.
The water
Or
subsided.
the water subsided, exactly. Or like by Avram Avinu, where he ignored the river when he was going to the Akedah. And what happened? The water disappeared. Right? It's like a dog that barks and barks and barks. You don't respond, he'll stop barking. Finished. Right? Then there's another, and we can elaborate on this idea of just ignoring a test. Right? But let's just talk about the highlights. That is another mode where you sort of rise above the difficulty and you find the resources within yourself that this issue no longer is a problem for you. So the problem hasn't gone away, but I've learned how to deal with it. Really deal with it, not just cope. But I've overcome it. For example, I mentioned yesterday a tragedy that somebody might have, where I mentioned that Shliach passed away very young, left a wife and kids and so on and so forth. So for them, the husband, the father, is gone. No measure of ignoring it and finding the inner strength to overcome that situation and to become rebalanced and healthy again and whole again will bring him back. Mashiach will bring him back. Tchias HaMesim will bring him back. However, people could deal with loss, right? Whether it's the loss of a loved one or even loss of stature, right? Loss of status, loss of losing money, right? One could deal with that and rediscover themselves, and not necessarily will it bring back those circumstances that existed before. But in the sense that one has overcome that, the problem has been removed. Okay? Then you have another situation, like you mentioned, in the Holocaust. It doesn't even have to be the Holocaust. If a person, has faith, if a person is ill, God forbid, or like you say, the Holocaust, where they ignored it, some at least, and you ignore and you have this mode, and it doesn't work. So what's that? Did the test fail? This is a failure in the system? Clearly, this must be in another category of situation. It's a different situation. What is that? It's called tragedy. What's a tragedy? Is it a test? What is it? So there must be something which is there's Avedis Abirurim, there's Avedis Anisyonis, right? And then there must be other things that exist that Hashem presents from above, which are there for other reasons and other circumstances, right? And not necessarily do they fall into these 2 defined categories that the Rebbe articulates in this Maimer. Clearly here the Rebbe is talking about situations where, in Avedis Hashem, it's something that we can more easily relate to. That when we have a taiva for something, right? And the taiva is overwhelming, and we can't overcome it. One of the methods of dealing with it is to ignore it. I remember hearing once that somebody wrote to the Rebbe that he has a taiva for, I think he was becoming more frum, and I think it was concerning cholav non-Jewish milk, right? Which is, there are plenty Yidden that serve, fulfill the mitzvahs and do eat cholav but, cholav there are people that are particular in cholav particularly if we talk about al-pi Kabbalah and beruch, more spiritually, it's something that one should try to be particular with. So he made a hachlata that he's not eating cholavakum anymore. But he had a taiva to, I don't know, one of these chocolate bars that was cholavakum, and it was just a taiva. You know, he lived all his life eating it, and he decided to break the habit. Sinish gegangen. So he made a hachlata that he's not doing it anymore, and he sustained it for a week or two or three, and then the taiva overwhelmed him, as durgefallen. He succumbed. He felt bad, he made another hachlata. This time he sustained it for 6 weeks. And every time he would stumble, he would make even a bigger hachlata. Stronger hachlata. And by the time, finally he was so despondent, he didn't know what to do. He wrote to the Rebbe, saying, it seems that the stronger the hachlata I make, the more difficulty I have to sustain it. The more difficulty the test. So the Rebbe said to him, don't build up your Yetzer Hara so big by making a bigger and bigger hachlata. In other words, by you making a bigger hachlata, and a bigger hachlata, and a bigger hachlata, the bigger the hachlata, the bigger the decision, the determination not to, you're giving life, you're giving the Yetzer Hara bigger mitzias, bigger existence. You're giving him energy. Ignore it. Just ignore it. And if you ignore it, you'll find that with time it'll become easier and easier. So in that sense, we could find the idea of this mode of serving Hashem, but it's important to define these things, and hopefully we will see how the Rebbe articulates the point in the Maimer, and throughout the Maimer, and we can go back and discuss and try to crystallize what falls into which bracket.